All right, welcome everybody. We are here to be talking about all the great things that are coming out for Pathfinder Deep Underground. Specifically, Paizo has been releasing for the Pathfinder role-playing game a number of dwarf-related content. And so we have a new book, Highhelm, that we're releasing, and we're also going to be talking today about the start of the Sky King's Tomb adventure path. So that way we can delve into not only a little bit about what these products are, but really also a behind-the-scenes take. Because why not? Like, you're going to be able to have the books in your hands by the time that you are seeing this video, so why not go beyond the pages and see what creativity led to creating the books that you have now?
We're going to delve deep.
Oh my gosh.
Before we go into this, maybe we should say who we are.
Oh yeah, that would help.
Well, we know. Hi, I'm Luis Loza. I am creative director for Pathfinder Rules and Lore. I was the narrative and development lead for Lost Omens Highhelm.
And I'm John Compton. I'm a senior developer who recently joined the Pathfinder Adventure Path team. And so Sky King's Tomb was my first project. So, Luis, we've had dwarves in the setting from day one.
Yeah.
What do we need to know about what Pathfinder dwarves were before we start getting into all of our more recent content?
Sure. Pathfinder dwarves were pretty interesting in a lot of ways and pretty familiar in a lot of ways, I think. The dwarves up until now are very classical dwarves. You know, they live underground in a lot of cases. They like smithing. A lot of them brew ale, things like that. A lot of your classical dwarven tropes are found within dwarves. But when you delve deeper into the history of dwarves and who they are as a culture, and I think that's when you start really identifying what makes a Pathfinder dwarf stand apart from other dwarves and other media and stories and stuff like that. In our history of our dwarves is a really unique event called the Quest for Sky, looking back at the origin of dwarves in our setting, in Lost Omens setting on Galarian in the Inner Sea. Dwarves originally lived underground. They weren't on the surface. They weren't all running around with the other humans and halflings and the other creatures that are up there. They all lived underground until one day they got a message from their god Torag, who said, "Hey, keep an eye out. There's going to be a sign, and when you get my sign, I want you to go find the sky. Whatever that is, go find it." The dwarves didn't really understand, but they eventually had an enormous earthquake that really shook things up deep underground where they live, and they decided, that's our sign, let's go find this so-called sky. And they traveled upward, eventually, after a very long time, reached the surface, found the sky that was above them on the surface world, and realized, oh, this will be our new home. Torag led us here for a reason. Let's figure out a way to live here. And there's this history that is so baked into the dwarven tradition and culture that kind of continues on to this day. Torag is still just as important. Those original settlements and homes that they made upon reaching the surface, the sky citadels, as they so called them, are still important and still a very big part of dwarven culture, which is why we decided to focus on one of them with Lost Omens Highhelm.
Yeah, and I think getting to that point about, like, dwarves are really familiar. One of the things that we've done over time with Pathfinder is give each of our playable ancestries a whole bunch more individualist personality. So I know that, there are plenty of dwarf enthusiasts where they're like, as long as I have beards and beer, then I'm good to go, and axes and hammers, yada, yada, yada. But I know with the beginning of Lost Omens and Pathfinder's second edition, we really made a big effort to start branching out. So what are a couple of things that we've done to introduce new, kind of specific to the Lost Omens setting, dwarf lore?
For sure. Well, we wanted our dwarves to still feel familiar, as I mentioned. They're traditionalists, but what the important traditions to them are things like clans and clan daggers and things and basically everything is built around the dwarven clan.
What's this clan dagger thing?
A clan dagger is a very important piece of equipment, armament, depending on how you use it, that you're given when you are born. When a dwarf is born, they receive their clan dagger, and this clan dagger is specially crafted just for them. Each dwarf is given their unique dagger at birth. The story is that it's used to cut your umbilical cord, and it's the first thing that ever tastes your blood as a dwarf. If you ever get into fights later, know that your clan dagger tasted the first blood. And you keep it, and that is part of an important ritual around your birth. There's a whole kind of welcoming ceremony to, a new life, and it includes the clan dagger, and it's something that you're expected to hold on to for the rest of your life. And depending on what clan you're from, the clan dagger has different functionalities. For example, clans can vary in types of focuses or just specialties, things like that. There might be a clan that's more focused on brewing. There's clans that are more focused on smithing. Some are farming, things like that. And your particular type of clan dagger from your clan might have different functions. In Highhelm, we discuss that there are clan daggers or one of these clans that do brew ale, and they have special gems that match the color of their specific ale. You put that gem, or you put that dagger into the ale, and if it disappears, you can't see that gem anymore. That means that it's been brewed correctly. It's the right color.
I do like having a clan dagger that's basically a Munsell chart, but for wizard crew. Yeah, and clan daggers kind of behind the scenes are one of those things that early in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, we were introducing various weapons that had ancestry traits to them. So like, okay, this thing has the orc trait, this thing has a dwarf trait. And for some of those, we had existing lore for them. And for some of them, we were just like, let's make sure everybody gets at least 2. And clan daggers kind of came out of that. And every year, their lore has expanded as we've been not only taking more time to think through what they represent in the setting, but also as we publish more and we invite more authors to write more about clan daggers and dwarven culture. And so the Highhelm book has really been an opportunity to just dive deep into what these represent and the culture behind them. And especially when we start showing art of different dwarves, you can kind of look for the clan dagger and see another little fragment of their personality, depending upon what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as I mentioned, with every clan having specific uses for their clan dagger, it also gives us an opportunity to really expand what a clan dagger does and looks like. So far, it's just been, stat-wise, kind of a basic dagger with a few extra traits, a little fancier dagger. But now we can say, oh, well, you might use it in a very specific manner. If you're with that farming clan, it's shaped in a specific way that effectively serves as a trowel that you can use to, dig up the dirt, which doesn't do anything in the middle of combat, but it's a fun thing to think about. Oh, can I use that in different ways? Can I be imaginative about my clan dagger? What does my clan dagger look like? Maybe I have a very special one that I had specifically made because there was an expectation that I would do a certain task, and now I'm maybe a character who doesn't do that, or I did lean into that. There's a lot of story built in to what your clan dagger does and looks like that. Hopefully, with this book, a lot of players get excited to build upon that for their stories.
Yeah, I like the clan daggers they're not just this sacred thing that you keep and you never use. It's very much like, hey, make some use of it. So now that we're using tools, now that we're doing things in Highhelm, like we have big old city, like what's actually going on in this place? Like why do we even go there? Why do we care about Highhelm?
Highhelm is big. I think that's part of it. There's a lot of people that live there, and when there's a lot of people, there's a lot of things going on. I think of the Sky Citadels, there are 10 Sky Citadels mentioned in this book. Highhelm is probably the most populous at this point. And I think that means there's a lot of potential for interesting stories. So much potential that we decided to do a little AP that kicks off there, right? That we wanted to focus on the city. The city is interesting in that it's built into a mountain. It's inside a mountain. It's being hollowed out to a degree. It's a mountain called the Emperor's Peak, and this mountain has various layers for the city. The city has an entire big spiral staircase. Well, staircase is a misnomer. It's more like an enormous spiral ramp because it's big enough to include carts and stuff that can make their way up and down the different levels. And it's just so populated that it has other ancestries living here. It's not just dwarves. There are elves, there are humans, there are orcs, there are goblins, there are elementals from the plane of fire living here. There's just a lot of interesting fantasy potential, I think, in a city like this. And it is visually a very interesting city because of that dynamic with the various layers. And also it's just kind of fun to see how dwarves live compared to the like of humans, right? We see a lot of human settlements in Pathfinder's past and other fantasy media. What do our dwarves look like, and what do their cities look like, and what are all the considerations that come with that? Like, how do they breathe underground? Where does the water come from? How are they dealing with their waste, right? Things like that.
Yeah, and those are some of the common bugbears that I have, because I'm always, whenever I'm doing dungeon design as a storyteller, I'm like, how do these things live here? Why do they live here? And like deep subterranean cultures are always real annoying on that front, just because it's like, how the heck do you sustain this city? Well, we eat mushrooms. You can't just eat mushrooms. And also, what do the mushrooms eat? Like, these are always these things that I try to answer questions about. So, like, what are a couple of the things that, especially the fantasy elements, that allow Highhelm to, sustain itself?
I don't want to just say that it's all magic, because it isn't. But a lot of it is magic, which is one of the benefits when you get to create stuff like this, is not necessarily hand-waving, but getting to use magic the way that you use technology or anything else in any other stories. Is it's an explanation, and with enough explanation, it all clicks together, because it's very easy to just say, well, they have magic and that's how they breathe and that's how they eat. But explaining that, well, their water comes from a connection to the plane of water, that is, I think, a better explanation than just, they magic up some water, no big deal. No, but then there's that idea that's like, okay, well, does that mean if I swim through the reservoirs of Highhelm, I could end up in the plane of water, do things anytime sneak by, is there a chance that could open up too wide and flood the entire mountain? That on its own already just tells you a lot of potential for stories. But there's also a lot of dwarven cunning. They're engineers, they're crafters. They have come up with a lot of ways to live here, because they were already living underground before they even showed up on the surface. They had this all figured out for millennia. So we get things like the breather walls, which are specialty moss that is grown by the druids of Highhelm that can create air and create breathable air for these people. Because, there's enough people living here that if there's not enough air holes in the mountain, you're going to run out of air. But yeah, we have this special moss, and it is magic, but there's at least that explanation that we have these special plants. There are these little creatures, little creatures called grindle grubs, which can feed on all the excess waste, so it's not just sitting around in the city. And if things go wrong and you're stuck in the city for a long time, well, you always have grindle grubs to eat too. And there's just a lot of different things that have been considered like that I think our authors are really good about fleshing out in a lot of cases. There's so many considerations that you don't think about, but the moment someone says, yeah, where does their water come from? You're like, oh, shoot, we didn't think of that. But luckily, we have thought out of a lot of this.
Yeah, and just going back at the point, you've referenced how, there are a lot of different ancestries living in Highhelm. I think that's one of the really important things that this book and kind of our approach to dwarves in the Lost Omens setting has done is combat one of the rather tired dwarven stereotypes of, they have these big stone cities, and in half the settings there's some narrative moment where they're just like, heck with it, close all the doors, we're going to seal ourselves off for a century. And while the dwarves of Highhelm have that ability, this is very much a city that they are wanting to bring people into. There are a lot of different hooks for not just engaging with characters that are already in Highhelm, but bringing in people to Highhelm. That way, as a storyteller, you don't just have to create a reason why the pieces are already there. You can be riffing on the various opportunities that are located in this book to kind of draw your players from wherever it is in the setting to Highhelm for all sorts of great reasons and lucrative opportunities.
For sure. Absolutely.
And really, that's things that I really like. Because when I joined on the Adventure Path team, Sky King's Tomb was already in progress. The writers already had their outlines and were starting to create words. But I was going through and basically identifying a whole bunch of different other narrative opportunities that we had. So I did a read-through of the Highhelm developed manuscript. And I was like, oh my gosh, I could do stuff with that. I could do stuff with that. I could do stuff with that. And because I was working on the first volume, Mantle of Gold, this is a first level adventure that takes you to level 4. I was like, oh boy, I can show off the rich variety of stuff that's in Highhelm as a way of really highlighting that this is not just all caves and underground and grindle grubs. And grindle grubs is still fun, but that there's really unexpectedly zany possibilities that you can do in a really staunchly traditionalist dwarven sky citadel. So, like you mentioned, the elemental planar connections. Like, it's not just the plane of water. There's the elemental plane of fire that gets a connection in the second highest level, King's Heart.
Yeah.
Because, like, one of the questions we have is, all right, they're smithing things. How do they fuel this stuff? And, like, if circulation's an issue, what do they do with all the exhaust fumes? Well, one of the issues is, what if we channel some of the plane of fire into things? And so they're like all these connections of, like, you know, playable fire elemental touched character ancestries, but also like, hey, we trade with the plane of fire, and sometimes creatures from the plane of fire get in. So there's one point in this adventure where, like, somebody has brought in a whole bunch of creatures called fire ferrets, which are kind of fire touched mustelid weasel things, and you know, shenanigans being shenanigans, they've gotten free. And so one of the things your PCs can do is they can help to wrangle these things before these flaming ferrets basically set fire to various parts of the city, and all the shenanigans that ensue. So, like, it's just going through and being like, oh wow, look at all these stories that we can tell, and so many of them are ones that are going to make you say, yes, classic notes of dwarven culture, and so many of them are also like, but also this. So it was a delight to look through kind of the pre-printing version of this.
Are there any... I don't want to spoil the adventure for anyone.
I do, but okay.
Well, are there any particular sites that drew your interest so much? We have to make sure that they show up in Sky Kings 2.
Yeah, there were a handful.
I know there's one in the depths. There's that whole part of the Thieves Guild, the Black Noon Thieves Guild little training ground, I think is one that you've mentioned before.
Yeah, the Black Noon Thieves Guild is also, just to give a little bit of context, really answers an important question when we have one of these locations that's like, hey, look, this is generally a safe city. And anytime that we have one of these, like, this is generally a safe city, this seems like a nice place to be, then all the narrative design folks just like table flip, like, how? Then what are we supposed to do here? On one hand, it's like, we really want to make nice, loving places, but on the other hand, we need to create some conflict. And so one of those conflict points is the Black Noon Thieves Guild, where it's not necessarily a thieves guild that is kicking in doors and robbing everybody, but it's like, we smuggle, we con, we extort. Yeah, and so the Black Noon Thieves Guild is kind of the big game in town with some challengers and competition. But one of the things they have is this thing called the Black Noon Gauntlet, which is this set of little scraggly interwoven tunnels that, you know, were probably carved out for mining or something like that in the past. But now it's been abandoned. Black Noon Thieves Guild has moved in and basically turned it into this, like, death trap maze. And they scatter a couple of specially minted coins of theirs throughout, such that if somebody goes in and manages to navigate most of the maze and find one of these coins and get out with it, they can basically go to the Black Noon Thieves Guild and be like, I would like to apply. And that's basically their resume, is to say, I have acquired one of these coins. They're like, go on. Clearly you're at least sufficiently qualified to join our ranks, but let's just make sure who you are. And so one of the little stories that you'll be able to explore is there's an NPC who has tried to find one of those, and it's not emerged, and their family and friends are very concerned. Can you please go and recover them? Hopefully they're still alive. So even where we have a relatively safe city, there's still all sorts of different little conflict points of things that can go wrong that really require player characters like you.
Sure. That was also a thing that I had to consider a lot with the outline. That was a question I was asked when I was sharing the outline with other people. Is this gonna be dangerous enough for adventurers to even want to hang out here? Because I very much, in my initial pitch, it's like, oh, this is lovely, you know, it's dwarf town and they do cool stuff, and you know, I guess if you go underground, it'll be dangerous. But I needed to make sure that we seeded in, not necessarily danger at every turn, but you know, strife, conflict, story potential in some way. So some of the stories here that have been seeded into Highhelm aren't just, there's a monster here and there's a bad guy here. There are conflicting ideologies, right? In a way that I think hasn't been something I've personally seen in a lot of media regarding dwarves is, again, they feel very stereotypical or one note, depending on how you want to look at that. But they don't have intrigue the way that, the court intrigue happens in some place like Taldor or Cheliax, right? And I wanted to make sure that kind of stuff was happening. Are there people who are doing, are they spying? Is there subterfuge? Are there not just from outside places, but within, are the different clans, are they getting along at all times? Are there specific, groups off to the shadows that are maybe trying to mess with things or guide things in a particular way that could lead to interesting stories that just happen to be, having dwarves as the main characters rather than your humans or whomever.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think of for like classic dwarves is very vendetta feeling, and certainly Lost Omens dwarves have kind of a sense of, hey, it takes a little time for them to warm up to you, but once you're a friend, you're a friend.
Long time.
and if you're not, if you have crossed them, then they remember. Dwarves remember. And so I think also one of the fun bits of Strife is like, there aren't just fresh points of contention, but there are also like generations old pain points of, why do we not get to live in this particular part of town? Oh, well, because that other client came in and did this thing in this part of town. Like, we've never really forgiven for them. Everybody else, all the neighbors are like, that was 1,000 years ago. What's wrong with you? Well, they still live there.
Grandma's still here. She remembers. Yes.
So they can both feel as deep of a storyline as you want, but they can also achieve a certain playful pettiness depending on how you want to present things.
And that's another, talking about the long scale of things, I had to make sure that was something that became understood with this book, in that dwarves take their time, and to them, taking their time happens to be many, many years. So if I take my time in, writing a draft for Pathfinder something or other, that might take me a few hours, but if I take my time, it might take me, the entire afternoon. Okay, it just happens to be that our time scales are relative such that, well, a long time for a dwarf is a really, really, really long time for someone else. And I also made sure to help scale some of these to more understandable time frames. There's a thing that's mentioned with the Five Kings Mountains, the general area where Highhelm is located, that includes a lot of other dwarven settlements, and the regional leaders meet up. And that used to be, every couple of centuries they would meet up to keep tabs on everything. How's everyone doing? Mm-hmm. The way that you might meet kind of every month or every week for a kind of town meeting kind of thing. It's like, well, things are going kind of bad in the inner city. We need to speed this up. So we'll meet up every 20 years.
They're serious.
They're very serious. And it's just interesting trying to keep that balance of like, is it leaning into the dwarven ideas that we've established here, but still usable for a GM or for players, right? We don't want to say, well, I'm mad at this this human that came by 4 centuries ago. He's gone, and his entire family's been wiped out since then. So why are you still mad?
This dwarven patron wants to hire you as part of his 10-year plot to get back at Jim Bob's. Like, okay, like, what do you need from us? And one of the things that's really important about Highhelm is that it's not just about Highhelm. Highhelm is also a gateway to the Darklands, which is our 3-level area of subterranean caverns full of all sorts of perils. And that's one of the other great things about telling stories here, because when we look at this first volume of Sky King's Tomb, you're going to do a lot of urban sandbox stuff early on. You're going to come back, you're going to do more interaction with them. But there's a sizable chunk of it that is going into kind of that preliminary bit of the Darklands to get your feet wet, so to speak. Understand what it's like to adventure in the dark on some rails, and experience some danger that you really were not expecting to find. Because that's really going to set you up for more of the adventure path that will take you deeper underground, farther and farther away from relative safety. So Highhelm, because it has an opening to the Darklands, makes it a natural crossroads for this sort of activity. So it can also be a home base for you to run a Darklands delve adventure.
Yeah, and the Darklands being as expansive as they are, we wanted to make sure we're a threat, but weren't so prominent that you couldn't feel like you couldn't live in Highhelm either. So we made sure to like close off most of the tunnels and say, you can't go through here, but I'm sure plenty of canny PCs will find their way past any guard that exists in the city.
Various story hooks and narrative elements can open almost any gateway.
Absolutely. So I've been kind of flipping through this book because it's wonderful. I think it's great. And I've been reminding myself of some of the fun little Easter eggs I've been peppering in here. So if you are in the know, you happen to know, then that's great. You know, you get to understand the fun little things. But there's a lot of things I've peppered in here. One of the things I'm kind of had most fun is if any of you checked out Lost Omens Travel Guide, we talked about pastimes, different board games, and things that people play. And wouldn't you know it, we name drop things like Imperial Conquest and the game Prismati in here as games that people play. There's a whole new item, I guess not magic box, a new item that is a specific board game board that has specific inputs. If you do very specific movements, it pops out secret compartments, and if you mention, oh, it might be games of Imperial Conquest or even Elemental Stones, a game that you'll be able to play yourself if you want to bring that out at the table and enhance your experience. You can play Elemental Stones, get a copy of that from us. But there's just a lot of nods to things that have been peppered throughout the Lost Omens books over the last several years that keeps popping up here and there. That is really, it's there for the super fans who happen to keep track of things. And I know that there's some of you that finally realized, oh yeah, hey, I've seen Imperial Conquest before. And it'll keep showing up because it's just kind of fun to make the world feel like it's connected that way when we keep mentioning Imperial Conquest or the Mage's deck of cards and stuff like that.
Yeah, and anytime that we introduce one of these setting books, I'm reminded of my time working on the organized play campaigns and how, to flip through these setting books and be like, all right, like what's the deal with this Dagger, or what sort of new story opportunities are being set up. And so flipping through a setting book can inspire all sorts of different quest ideas. And that was definitely the case with Travel Guide, because I had this idea in my head if I really want to have like some sort of sports team moment, and well, it doesn't say you can't have a Leshy playing basketball little moment, pipe butter or whatever we want to call it. Yeah. And so I was really excited. In the Travel Guide, there's this game called Basilisk, which is this horrific full contact like
fantasy rugby.
Yeah, blindfolded rugby game. And so one of the little side distractions or side quest moments that you can have is there's an out-of-town team fighting fire pelts from Varissia, and oh no, one of our star players for the Highhelm Hodags has been taken out of commission. We need somebody to step up. Oh, but I hear one of your players is trained in athletics and/or acrobatics. Maybe you can step in and save the day. So you totally can play a game of Basilisk and win all sorts of acclaim in Highhelm. Be very popular. I think you get free drinks for a week if you win.
A week?
Yeah,
I think I would exploit that to a dangerous degree. Especially because there's some drinks in the Highhelm book that if you get those for free, you're getting a lot of extra fun powers. But I'll leave people to discover that one. Those are a little more secret. The Sky Kings 2 in Mature Path starts in Highhelm, and you mentioned it has Highhelm as kind of a headquarters that people can return to. What kind of things outside of Highhelm can you expect to see? You're not going to be there the entire time, but are you going to be running into, I guess you're going underground. What kind of stuff are you going to be running into?
The Darklands, it's not just dark caves and tunnels and whatnot. It does have some of that. Don't be mistaken there. But it also has a whole bunch of really interesting fantasy RPG cities and settlements and the like. And so you're going to be going to a couple of those. Each one a little bit farther from safety. Each one a little bit deeper into the Darklands in the upper third, Narboth. And so the first one is going to be like very natural feeling. It has a whole bunch of strange illumination and some really strange inhabitants that's going to create a great contrast to what you experienced in Highhelm. And then as you go deeper and deeper, you're going to find that there's, settlements. Yeah, they're a place to restock, place of safety. But the people of the Darklands oftentimes aren't the friendliest folk. And particularly in our second volume, you're going to find out just how unfriendly they can be. But you got to go in there because there's some really important information and other MacGuffins and the like that your PCs need in there. So just as I was showing off a whole bunch of what you can do in Highhelm and the variety of stories you can tell there, the same thing was going for the later 2 volumes and the types of adventures and locales that we go to in the Darklands. So, yeah, looking forward to that.
For sure. So, I guess I'll say this up front. If things end up kind of tiptoeing into spoiler territory, we're sorry, but also behind the scenes, and that kind of happens. I know that Sky King's Tomb ends up, this is more than Easter egg material, right? It ends up pulling on very specific material from Lost Omens Legends as a kind of foundational bit of work for the overall plot, the overall elements going on there. What do you want to share about all of those connections?
Yeah, so at the very beginning of our talk, you talked about the Quest for Sky. And like the Quest for Sky is a long process, long migration, and that, even for dwarves, it was long. And without firm focus, even leadership, that sort of thing is likely to fall apart and splinter. And like there was some splintering. Some groups did branch off to other parts of our world, but it would have fallen apart were it not for a person named Targic, eventually known as High King Targic, because people were so tickled with how good he was at leading them. And so Targic basically leads them to the surface. They get up top. He helps to oversee some of the Sky Citadel construction. But really, after a couple of years on the surface, they really are kind of managing themselves. So increasingly, Targic takes more of a step back, and eventually he has enough time to think about what was involved in the Quest for Sky. Like, what did we have to get through in order to get here? And that really taps into some of our older dwarf lore, and even some of the sort of classic RPG dwarf lore, in that dwarves have vendettas. Dwarves have some ancestral enemies that they really can't help but punch sometimes. And as we've really looked at the Lost Omens setting and asked ourselves, like, how can we open up more of the setting, especially from a player character perspective, we sort of also been re-examining some of the relationships that various groups, ancestries, and nations have with each other. And this dwarves have so many enemies thing is one of those. And Targic was really catching on to that. Like, he was like, we got here, that was great, but whose nose did we have to bloody in order to get here? What enemies did we make along the way? And the answer is a lot of them. And so he disappeared toward the end of his life in order to kind of do a little bit of soul searching, but also supposedly to make kind of his own hidden tomb. He'd snubbed the big old fancy mausoleum that all of his dwarven friends had made for him. And they're like, what? And he disappears underground. Everybody's like, we never heard from him again. So he's kind of a big mystery. Your player characters are going to be able to find out some of what that final fate of Targic is, and also what some of his unfinished business is. And so this is going to involve going into the Darklights and meeting with a whole bunch of people who quite rather would like you to be dead, but also a fair number of them where their desire to see you dead is based on some really old crimes and baggage and conflict that you might be able to play a role in helping to alleviate, helping to rebuild some breaches, rather than just rolling initiative and punching in faces, which gets to plenty of anyway. Sure. But speaking of the Legends thing, there was this bit in Lost Omens Legends where Targic kind of had like this last will and testament that kind of gotten buried by some of the dwarven elite and record keepers. And the start of the Highhelm book has much more detail about like what it was he was writing. Again, didn't really get disseminated too widely. And so that has been a really big piece of inspiring the Sky King's Tomb story. So it's not just about delving to find, Tutankhamun's tomb equivalent and be like, woohoo, rooms, treasure, hot diggity damn, we gained a level. But it's also about delving into dwarven history and what is known and what should have been known and what you do with that information.
It's kind of earth-shattering revelations in some cases. A lot of reckoning might be had among the dwarven culture in the wake of well, your PCs completing the journey to the Sky Kings too, I think, at the end.
Yeah, and it even digs up a little bit of, with Pathfinder Remaster, we're moving beyond alignment, but when we have, looking back, looked at alignment and some of our deities, like Torag, the head of the Dwarven Pantheon, is lawful good, like, should be pretty darn good. And, one of his edicts is basically kick down the enemies of your people before they have a chance to kick you. It's like, whoa, that's a lot of preemptive strike there, Mr. Holy Man. You sure about this? And there's a bit of that that's kind of infused into Dwarven culture of being very pragmatic in how you take down potential threats to Dwarven people. And that's a struggle to really mesh it with what it means to be good. And that's, again, kind of one of those little themes that gets explored with this adventure path. The adventure path is not going to like funnel you into a very specific way of thinking, but there are going to be a lot of little plot threads that you can pick up from the past and ask yourself, like, how do we want to handle this? What's the way going forward? And what role do we have in playing and in seeing that evolution?
There's also a thing that, as the narrative lead, I get to decide a lot of the story elements that we wanted to see throughout this. It's not the same kind of story that you explore in an AP, but there's still story going on. There's still a living, breathing setting here, right? There's a whole lot of elements going on. But one of the things I was trying to seed is the idea that it's not just dwarves that are changing. It might even be the cosmology. It might even be the deity. If it's like the Torag himself that is having to, reckon with things and decide some things. By the time, depending on when you're watching this video, you may or may not have the remaster rules available to you. You'll see that we've tweaked Torag's anathema just a little bit. It's a little bit more lenient. It doesn't just say, strike first at all times. It says strike first when you realize there's no other choice. Mm-hmm. It's kind of is what it's saying. It's something along the lines of offer mercy repeatedly when someone has shown that they are undeserving of it.
So there's a little bit of a ceremony element to it where it's like redeem, and step 5 is, are they still not redeemed? Okay, now you can burn with fire.
But there's that, and there's some elements that I've been seeing here to showcase some of these changes that are a little subtler. You have to. Well, there's a lot of stuff that is long term. I feel like I've found myself thinking like a dwarf in a lot of cases. But there's an entry on the Dwarven Pantheon which focuses on Torag and his entire family, his wife and all his children, all these other people. There's 10 figures in the Dwarven Pantheon. Normally, most dwarves are like, that Droskar guy, I don't want to associate with him. So we'll worship the Pantheon without Droskar. And it mentions, oh yeah, if you're into that, you call the Dwarven Pantheon the Skykeepers, because Droskar stayed behind during the quest for Sky. These other 9, they cared about the Sky. But if you're not, there's some people who are like, well, that Torag guy is actually too important, and let's just focus on these other 8 as well. So Droskar and Torag, you go away, and we'll focus on the Forgekin Pact. And that was, in a way, a nod to the Starfinder. If you play Starfinder, you're aware that Torag's not around for some reason. But if you're a dwarf, you might still want some dwarven goodness to kind of follow someone. So in the Starfinder era, you might look to the Dwarven Pantheon, and wouldn't you know, you have the Forgekin Pact that you can look at. There's 8 of that. Look at that. Very perfect. But there might also be other reasons why you might consider, why don't I want Torag? Is Torag someone I want to keep worshiping? And that's the thing. I think in the coming years, we'll see more dwarves asking that question for
a variety of reasons.
A number of reasons, yes.
Yeah, and that's not the only place that you're going to find the various members of the Dwarven Pantheon. We also have some information about the Dwarven Pantheon in the Player's Guide for the Sky King's Tomb Adventure Path. So that way you can see what their edicts, anathema, favorite weapons, all that stuff is, in case you want to play a follower of one of them. And one other thing that I'd mention with the Player's Guide, tying back to that Darklands exploration, is that Sky King's Tomb is almost entirely underground. So there is a really cool article in there that's called Adventuring in the Dark that is all about, hey, what do you need to keep in mind when you're exploring passageways, when your characters don't all have dark vision, when there is no certain source of food or water or whatever, to make sure that you are as equipped as possible with not only how your PCs can survive in that area, but also how you as players can kind of have a sense of what's going to be involved in this AP, kind of priming yourself for what lies ahead.
So it sounds like Dwarven Pantheon, darkness, underground stuff starting in Highhelm. So I have to play a dwarf for this AP, right?
Not at all. Certainly, it's going to work out great if you play the dwarf. Like, you're going to fit right in. But the player's guide has probably a dozen different other ancestry entries that are giving a whole bunch of different hooks as to what might draw somebody of this particular background here. So whether you want to play anybody from the kind of core ancestries and a variety of others that have shown up in our various other Lost Omens and Pathfinder RPG books, you're going to find a whole bunch of hooks that will bring in from kobolds and Uruxi lizard folk to Amarim cat folk to various like celestially imbued characters for all of the all variant heritages, reversal heritages, that is. Even talking a little bit about, hey, do you want to play an orc? Do you want to play a half-orc? Totally doable. Even the one I'm really happiest about in the player's guide is the rules for playing, or the onboarding for playing a skeleton character. Because, like, look, we've done a lot of work in the past 5 years to be like, here's how you can play a hobgoblin and not deal with kind of the way back when RPG assumption that you're going to get, attacked on sight. But, like, undead takes a couple of somersaults beyond that. And so the idea that you can go into this AP and say, hey, you said this is about digging up ancient history and like undoing past wrongs. What if I were a skeletal character who basically has like one final wrong that I am trying to undo? And the majority of Highhelm is going to look at you and say, that's, kudos. Like, we can respect that. So long as you resolve that thing and then hopefully are not undead after that. But yeah, we're totally willing to support you as you run around being a skeleton of whatever core ancestry it was. So there are tons of different ways to get involved, no matter what type of character you have in mind. And tied into that, just like all of our other adventure paths, there's a nice set of campaign-specific backgrounds that are going to give you some interesting hooks. They're going to adjust a little bit of like what your party's reputation is when you start. So whether you are playing... oh gosh, I'm kind of trying to remember what it's called, but it's basically like villainous past, where you've come to Highhelm in order to understand not only history and historical atrocities, but also to understand something deep in your own family's past that has continued to haunt you, even though you were not the person who did it. But they can't help but hear your name and be like, oh, you're that one, aren't you? And so that reduces your reputation a little bit, but it gives you some other really cool hooks. And a bunch of them also come with like connections that you have in Highhelm of the people who sponsored you to travel there, or who have specifically invited you to collaborate on different projects. So yeah, you're going to find a whole bunch of different hooks that if you didn't already have a character idea for playing Sky King's Tomb, you're going to be able to look at that player's guide and come up with 6 more.
One thing I wanted to make sure, knowing that Sky King's Tomb was in production as well, these books, or these whole projects kind of happen almost parallel, is, we talked about Dwarven clans earlier and how they're so important. We wanted to have information on what if I'm not a dwarf, but I want to join a Dwarven clan. So there's some information here. If you are maybe perhaps a group of adventurers that delved deep into the Darklands and earned a lot of respect among the people of Highhelm, there might be people who say, hey, come join our clan, and there's information for GMs and players to use that as a kind of jumping off point. It's not full-on rules on how to join a clan, but it gives you enough information on what kind of to expect, and maybe you'll even get your own clan dagger as a result.
Yeah, and our first volume of the Sky King's Tomb Adventure Path as well introduces you to a lot of NPCs, organizations, and other groups within Highhelm. So that way, like when I'm creating adventures, especially when I'm doing an urban sandbox for low level, like the thing that I really love to do is shotgun all sorts of different ideas and possibilities out of the players, because and speak for myself, like when I create a new character, sometimes I have a real big backstory for them and I know exactly how they're going to play, but usually it's just sort of like, I have a couple of little bullet points on my index card of how I think this guy plays, but I really just need to get exposed to a couple of game sessions to figure out what the voice is, what the motivations are. And so Mantle of Gold, this first volume, really shows you a whole bunch of different groups, motivations, stories, connections that could excite your characters and your players in all sorts of different ways and make you think, okay, I didn't know what I was doing when I started this thing, but now I'm clearly all about this. And I love that sort of moment where a player's eyes open up. They're just like, can I make this like my character's identity, or can I join this group, or can I raise all of these weird creatures that you put in the back of the Highhelm book there? So I love that.
So Striking's Tomb, a lot of reclaiming the past. What can you tell me? I think very tied to the past in this AP about relics, dwarven relics.
Yeah. So in Game Mastery Guide, you're going to find that there's a whole bunch of great information about relics. These are items that have an important historical foundation, connection, cult potential, whatever it is, that when a player character gets a hold of them, then these relics can grow with PC. They kind of create a little bit of your treasure per level, as they give you all sorts of different powers that are tied to a couple of different aspects that each relic has. And given the historical themes that dwarves really play with, where it's like, this ancient axe is really important, not just because it's old, but because it's imbued with power. That was really something I wanted to play with. And so I brought in the relic system. And you're going to be able to find a variety of different relics over the course of the first 2 volumes, each one of which is telling you more of the story that will allow it to grow with each one of your player characters. The growth potential for them is a little bit loose. That way the GM has some leeway as to what moments can cause that growth. It allows also for the player to kind of self-motivate some of their actions as well. So if my blue pen of relic potential here is like, well, you have to make sure that you have used the written word in order to de-escalate a situation. Suddenly I, as a player, am like, oh man, I gotta start using this pen to write some cool things that'll help me with diplomacy checks. It's that sort of thing that gives them another little hook that can inspire their own role playing. But those play with not only the Game Mastery Guide, different aspects, but there's even a new aspect, the Forge aspect, that shows up in the Highhelm book, and one of your relics is going to tie into that as well.
Sonny, you mentioned the de-escalation with the writing, and my first thought is, as a player, is, oh, well, I got to find situations to escalate so that I can de-escalate them with my writing.
No, player characters fault. and that's just the joy of a sandbox adventure, where you can provide only so much information to the GM to keep the thing on rails. But players are going to be players.
For sure. Okay, so I can play a halfling, sure, and I can find this clan to join, all these other things. I might find a relic. I know I'm traveling to the Darklands, but what kind of dangers specifically? Are there going to be new monsters? Are there going to be old classics showing up?
Yeah, so there are, not only are there going to be some new creatures that you've never seen before, but also some variants and further examples of some classic creatures. Because the Darklands, there's a lot of different groups hiding out down there, ranging from Zolgaths to Deep Gnomes to... there's a group called the Hringar, which are basically these dwarves that when they heard the Quest for Sky call, they were like, we're good here. No, thanks. And stayed behind and had to adapt. And just as I've mentioned with revisiting Dwarven history and why are we enemies with different folks, a lot of these groups are going to be hostile, but that doesn't mean you necessarily have to resolve everything with combat. Certainly can, but there are opportunities to take some nonviolent or clever solutions to things. In addition to that, though, there's always a challenge when we're creating adventures to say, okay, what are we seeing a lot of? And in the case of the Darklands, we have a lot of things with 2 legs and 2 arms and a head and basically human-shaped. So, yeah. And so there's a lot of things where it's like, okay, how can we add other stuff in here? Part of that comes from just what the dangers are of navigating the Darklands. There are a few passageways that have been broadened out in order to act kind of like underground highways, but there's a lot of kind of tight fits and whatnot. And so in the course of playing the adventure, you're going to be able to use different skills to navigate and advance through areas. Sometimes it's so that you can access cool things. Sometimes it's so that you can get away from them. There's a particularly fun chase moment in the second volume that I'm excited to see people play through. So expect to see plenty of subterranean humanoids, plenty of subterranean, oozes, quadrupeds, undead, things like that. And also to encounter some things that is better if you don't fight them. But you have to find some other way past them because the Darklands are dangerous. And not every single thing you encounter is going to be something that you can safely punch.
Right, now I'm actually going to ask for what could be spoilers here. So, as much as we'd like to, I don't think we can sit here all day. We got to get back and do some other work and get some other adventures done and other Lost Omens books done. But I do want to ask, what are some of the things that you find most exciting in the AP, or things you peppered in that were Easter eggs or just secrets that you want to share with the viewing audience? What are some just fun things, even if it's just like a little one sentence thing?
Yeah, just a handful of things that come to mind. One of them is that I'm really excited about. There's a minor clans sidebar in Highhelm that covers some of the folks that are not in part of the Big 12, and Clan Pearl Cask really got me going because it's all about like aquaculture in the deepest parts of Highhelm. So there's a part where you get to help this giant crab rancher resolve an issue that he has, and there's art that we could probably put up on screen of his prize crab that is in distress, a mammoth beast called Lady Shimmer Snip, whose art brief and I think included the term pearlescent in the art order. So there's that. There's also one of the lesser known things that's outside of the Dwarven pantheon is a spiritual tradition called Rivathun. And that's a very animism-heavy Dwarven tradition that goes way back. And you're going to deal with some Rivathun elements in several of the books. And that includes a returning figure who first appeared in, I think it was Pathfinder RPG Adventurer's Guide in first edition, so probably about 7-8 years ago. So that character makes a return, but we also explore some Rivathun angles, including some Rivathun character options that I think people are going to be really excited to play around with. And that really ties into just like, when we think about dwarves, we think about, oh yeah, divine magic, sure. But occult, not as often, but there's some really cool occult nuggets that you're going to find in the course of this AP.
Any particular callbacks to other Dwarven material or other adventures that you can think of that were particularly fun?
If you look to Pathfinder campaign setting, Innersea Castles, there's a quick gazetteer on Highhelm that introduces this guy named Bellum, who's basically like running this for-profit prison on the edge of the city. Yeah, we talked about Highhelm being a nice place. How does this guy survive? Well, he probably won't when it comes to player characters having something to say about it. You'll be able to dig up some great dirt on him.
You mentioned the lesser clan, the smaller clans, I guess, minor clan, is the proper word. And I guess I just realized one thing that we never got to really show off to our fans completely is the concept art for the 12 main clans in Highhelm, which, being a visual medium, now's our chance to start putting them up here on the screen. We have 12 different clans, and our concept artist, Kent Hamilton, did great work with and worked with one of our writers, Leanne Marcel, who was writing these clans out in developing the look for a lot of these clans. So we have Clan Erengeld, who is our kind of commerce clan, and they have things like coins tied in their beard and hair. So there's a lot of these. I don't want to just like go through each of the details from the concept art, but we'll be putting these on screen right now, so you can go through all 12 of those and finally take a look at all the fun little details and notes that Kent included that helped come back to the book and flesh things out. So yeah, there are interesting things like one of the clans, the magical clan, which is Clan Runebinder, talks about how they use throat singing to perform their verbal components for their spells, which is just doesn't change anything mechanically, but it's just a really interesting thing to think of someone casting a spell during the throat singing, which I'm not even going to attempt to imitate right now, but it's just kind of a fun idea. And there's a thing that's been happening over the years is with Kent around, we get to do concept art, and I've been doing it more and more in advance, and it does shape a lot of the world and the books that we end up designing. Those visuals go a long way with selling the ideas to our authors, to us internally about what these are. Kent's also been helping us with the new dragons for our remaster and stuff, and this stuff is just great. We want to make sure someone gets to see these at least at some point, so that's why we're bringing this up now to show these off.
If you're a fan of Starfinder, Kent was also the concept artist for all of our mechs. And like, oftentimes we will get art who will say like, oh wow, a lot of these dwarves have daggers, we should do something with that, and a lot of people clan daggers. But Kent is really proactive in getting a couple of like quick summaries of what it is we want to accomplish with a group of people. And then he does a lot of invention in his concept art. And when he brings it to us, he's like, well, I was thinking that they probably need to, not catch on fire, and they need to be able to see in this, and they need to breathe safely and whatnot. So I put in this, and this. And we're like, fantastic. We can totally incorporate that. So he's a really proactive concept artist and is an integral part of the creative process.
Shout out to Kent. We love Kent and his great work. What other things? I'm trying to think of any other secrets I want to share. So the history, the chapter that goes through the entire Dwarven history makes mention of all these Dwarven kingdoms that existed before the Quest for Sky happened. They take off, and there they go. But there's a couple of points throughout that Quest for Sky where they get broken off or wiped out entirely. So it makes mention that two kingdoms split off in a different direction. They went south, and the other two traveled west, and one traveled east. So those became the dwarves that ended up in the Long Expanse, the dwarves that ended up in Arcadia, and the dwarves that ended up in Tianxia, respectively. There's also mention that they get into a fight with orcs at some point, and two additional kingdoms are wiped out, and a third was cut off and forced to retreat. For those who haven't kind of figured out what that's suggesting, is that that's probably the Dwarven kingdom that went off and ended up in Casmaron. So we made sure that somehow dwarves ended up on each continent, so you have dwarves at some point. And when that happened was during the Quest for Sky. When you're underground, it's much easier to reach things across Galarian when you don't have to cross an ocean. You can just go under the ocean instead.
No, easy as that.
Easy as that. Boy, I'm trying to see if there's any other fun little things that have been peppered in through here. Can you think of, or at least any fun things that jumped out to you, whether or not they were meant to be fun little secrets in Highhelm or Sky King's Tomb?
I think the important thing that I'll end with is that Highhelm is a living place. Yeah. There's a lot of ancient artwork and architecture that traces its life back to the first millennium of Dwarven surface occupation, but there's ongoing construction, there's ongoing tunneling, down to the point where there are even laws as to where you can or cannot tunnel, because we don't want this whole mountain to collapse things very much. But what that means is that there's always something new that's being added, and there's room to grow. And that's one of the things that really fights this idea that dwarves are a static culture. They're not. They're always changing, they're always incorporating things. And a lot of the plot hooks that we have are speaking to a bunch of the reasons why they are even doubling down on how much they are interacting with their neighbors and the greater world, which is always going to provide new opportunities to bring in your player characters and experience the action.
One last thing that I wanted to mention here. We have a couple monsters in Highhelm, and some of them are gross, and some of them are just fun little... Yeah, it's a lizard you can ride, or a very stubborn mule, but the Paglin is one that I got to sneak in the word Thagamizer. It's not a secret that Thagamizer is in this book. It's just a fun little thing that I wanted to include, because for those of you in the know, Thagamizer is the weird little spikes at the end of Stegosaurus's tail, and I thought, why not give one of our creatures a Thagamizer and then specifically call it out, because that is the official term, it turns out. It just sounds like something made up. It kind of was, but all words are made up, aren't they?
I think that's really great, because we've been able to explore how you can get started in Highhelm, how you can experience all sorts of adventures, and Luis has ended with a Thagamizer, which is a great way for your adventures to end in Highhelm.
Absolutely. Those of you who are interested in Highhelm or Sky King's Tomb, please go to Paizo.com or your favorite local game store. These books are available now. You can learn all the great secrets that lie within Highhelm and beyond.
Been great speaking with you, and we look forward to meeting up with you at conventions and showing off all the cool adventures that are to come.